So Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system just experienced a catastrophic depletion of interceptors, and what military analysts are now revealing should genuinely alarm every American who cares about regional stability and the strategic implications for U.S. commitments worldwide. And retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor didn't just raise concerns or sound warnings. He systematically laid out how Israel's vaunted defensive shield has been depleted by approximately 95%, leaving Israeli airspace essentially unprotected against the kind of mass saturation attacks we've seen escalating across the region, in a briefing so alarming that defense experts are calling it one of the most significant strategic vulnerabilities exposed in modern Middle Eastern conflict. And what triggered this complete collapse of Israel's air defense capability? Months of relentless rocket barrages, drone swarms, and ballistic missile attacks that have simply overwhelmed a system designed for intermittent threats, not sustained multi-front warfare. This isn't just another round of regional tensions or the usual Middle East conflict cycle. We're talking about the systematic depletion of a defensive system that has been the cornerstone of Israeli security doctrine for over a decade, a fundamental threat to the strategic balance that has prevented full-scale war. And trust me, when retired colonels with Macgregor's credentials and access to intelligence assessments use language this stark, you know the situation is far more critical than public statements acknowledge. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching a defensive system that cost billions of dollars and was considered nearly impenetrable simply run dry in real time, with potentially catastrophic implications for regional stability. Let me walk you through exactly what happened and why this moment is so significant. Israel's Iron Dome system has been the primary shield protecting Israeli cities and infrastructure from rocket attacks for over 12 years. But most people don't fully understand what's been happening beneath the surface as regional tensions have escalated. The system, which consists of mobile batteries equipped with Tamir interceptor missiles, was designed to intercept short-range rockets and artillery shells fired from distances of 4 to 70 kilometers. Each interceptor costs approximately $40,000 to $50,000, and each Iron Dome battery holds roughly 20 interceptors that can be rapidly reloaded. Viewers might remember the dramatic footage from previous conflicts showing Iron Dome successfully intercepting hundreds of rockets launched from Gaza, creating those distinctive contrails over Israeli cities that became synonymous with Israeli technological superiority. But according to multiple defense analysts' assessments compiled through late 2024 and early 2025, everything changed when Iran-backed militant groups shifted from sporadic rocket attacks to sustained, coordinated saturation campaigns designed specifically to overwhelm the system. According to sources familiar with Israeli defense logistics, the rate of interceptor consumption has dramatically exceeded Israel's ability to manufacture replacements or secure emergency supplies from the United States. Intelligence estimates suggest Israel has expended approximately 95% of its interceptor inventory across multiple simultaneous fronts. Here's how this works and why it matters. Iron Dome operates on a simple but expensive principle. Fire costly interceptors at incoming projectiles to prevent them from hitting populated areas. The system works brilliantly when attacks are limited. But when adversaries launch thousands of cheap, mass-produced rockets and drones specifically designed to drain interceptor supplies, the economic mathematics become unsustainable. A $500 rocket can force Israel to fire a $50,000 interceptor. This is significant because once adversaries recognize the system is depleted, the deterrent value collapses entirely. But here's where everything changed. According to multiple intelligence assessments, hostile forces have begun coordinating attacks across multiple fronts simultaneously, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria, Houthis launching longer-range strikes, and continued pressure from Gaza, creating a multi-axis threat that has systematically drained Israeli stockpiles. According to defense production experts, Israeli manufacturers can produce approximately 2,000 interceptors annually under surge conditions, while the U.S. can provide emergency supplies from existing stocks. But recent combat has consumed interceptors at rates exceeding 3,000 per month during peak periods. And let's be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. Modern air defense systems are designed with the assumption that conflicts will be time-limited. What we're witnessing is a sustained war of attrition specifically designed to exhaust defensive capabilities. No system, no matter how technologically advanced, can sustain indefinite defense against numerically unlimited cheap projectiles. This type of strategic depletion doesn't happen to advanced military powers with robust defense industrial bases. It happens when someone faces coordinated adversaries willing to sacrifice thousands of cheap weapons to drain expensive defensive systems. The fact that we've reached this point tells you everything about how dramatically the regional threat environment has evolved beyond Israel's defensive planning parameters. Now here's where this story gets truly alarming. According to analysis from Colonel Douglas Macgregor, whose military intelligence background and strategic assessments have proven prescient on multiple conflicts, combined with reporting from defense publications like Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly, here's exactly what has unfolded. Over the course of the past 6 months, Israeli Iron Dome batteries have been engaged in near-continuous intercept operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. Northern batteries face Hezbollah rocket artillery and increasingly sophisticated drone swarms launched from Lebanon. Southern systems continue intercepting projectiles from Gaza. Eastern defenses now face periodic ballistic missile threats. Even relatively quiet borders have seen probing attacks designed to force Israel to maintain dispersed, ready defensive postures. According to Macgregor's assessment based on production data and observed engagement rates, the mathematics became unsustainable within the first 90 days of sustained operations. Macgregor stated in his analysis that current Israeli interceptor stockpiles have been reduced to approximately 5% of pre-conflict levels, meaning the vaunted Iron Dome shield that has protected Israeli civilians for over a decade now exists largely in name only. The Israelis are facing a strategic nightmare that no amount of technological superiority can solve, Macgregor explained. You cannot win a war of attrition when your interceptors cost $50,000 and your adversary's rockets cost $500. The mathematics are brutally simple. This assessment fundamentally changes everything we thought we understood about the regional balance of power. The reaction from Israeli officials has been carefully managed but telling. According to Defense Ministry statements, Israel has requested emergency interceptor supplies from the United States and has accelerated domestic production, but notably has not disputed the fundamental assessment that stockpiles are critically depleted. But the true bombshell came when U.S. defense production officials acknowledged that American interceptor stockpiles are themselves limited and that ramping up production to meet Israeli demand would take months or years, not the weeks that current threat assessments require. Defense industrial base experts noted that the specialized components for Tamir interceptors require specific manufacturing capabilities that cannot be rapidly expanded, and that the U.S. faces its own strategic stockpile concerns given commitments to Ukraine and potential Taiwan contingencies. This moment fundamentally destroys everything Israeli defense doctrine has been built upon for the past decade. The assumption that Iron Dome provided a reliable shield allowing Israel strategic flexibility became completely untenable the moment interceptor stockpiles dropped below the threshold needed to defeat a coordinated mass attack. But this wasn't just one analyst's alarming assessment. The evidence of critical depletion goes much deeper. First, there's the production data from Israeli defense contractors and U.S. supply chain reporting. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, the primary manufacturer of Tamir interceptors, publicly acknowledged ramping up production to emergency levels, language that confirms extraordinary demand. Industry analyses indicate maximum Israeli production capacity of approximately 2,000 interceptors annually, even under surge conditions. Meanwhile, observed engagement rates during peak conflict periods exceeded 100 interceptors per day across all active batteries. According to defense production experts, this creates an unsustainable consumption versus production gap that can only be bridged by drawing down existing stockpiles, which is precisely what has occurred. Second, U.S. military aid packages and emergency resupply requests confirm what we already knew. Congressional notifications for emergency defense assistance to Israel have included specific line items for Iron Dome interceptor resupply totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. The frequency and size of these requests have increased dramatically, indicating accelerating consumption. This connects to Israeli production constraints because it demonstrates that domestic manufacturing cannot keep pace with operational demands, forcing reliance on U.S. stockpiles that are themselves finite. Third, and this is what experts are calling most damaging, observable changes in Israeli defensive postures demonstrate the real-world impact of interceptor shortages. Recent attacks that previously would have triggered comprehensive Iron Dome responses have instead been met with selective engagement, prioritizing protection of critical infrastructure and population centers while allowing impacts in less critical areas. This eliminates Israel's primary defensive narrative that its citizens are protected from rocket attacks regardless of regional tensions. What makes this evidence so powerful is how it all fits together. This isn't one alarmist analyst or single data point. This is production statistics, congressional aid packages, manufacturer statements, and observable operational changes, all pointing to the same conclusion. Now, none of this should surprise anyone who's been paying attention. This pattern of technological solutions confronting mathematical reality has repeated throughout military history. Just look at how Israel handled the 2006 Lebanon war against Hezbollah. Israeli forces entered Lebanon with technological superiority and confidence that precision strikes would quickly neutralize Hezbollah's capabilities. Instead, they encountered a well-prepared adversary willing to absorb casualties, fighting from prepared positions, using relatively simple weapons effectively. The conflict dragged on far longer than Israeli planners anticipated and ended with Hezbollah claiming victory. The pattern: technological superiority cannot always overcome determined adversaries with numerical advantages and willingness to sustain attrition. Then there was Israel's response to the 2014 Gaza conflict. Iron Dome performed brilliantly, intercepting the vast majority of rockets that threatened populated areas. The system was hailed as game-changing technology that fundamentally altered the strategic equation. The playbook was seductive, technology providing a defensive solution that reduced pressure for difficult political compromises. But that conflict was time-limited, involved a single adversary, and ended before interceptor stockpiles faced critical depletion. And we can't forget the Abraham Accords period, when regional normalization seemed to be reducing Israel's multi-front threat environment. Israeli defense planners developed strategies assuming reduced threat levels, potentially leading to stockpile decisions based on overly optimistic threat assessments. This behavior didn't start with Iron Dome or even modern conflicts. Even in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israeli overconfidence based on 1967 success led to intelligence failures and inadequate preparation for a coordinated multi-front attack. The pattern is unmistakable. Technological superiority and past success create confidence. Confidence leads to assumptions that may not account for adaptive adversaries. Adversaries study Israeli systems, develop counters, and exploit vulnerabilities. Crisis emerges when reality doesn't match assumptions. But here's what's different this time. The adversaries have developed a systematic counter strategy specifically designed to exploit Iron Dome's economic and logistical mathematics. Mass saturation attacks using cheap projectiles to drain expensive interceptors. That strategy of relying on technological defensive shields worked against limited, sporadic attacks. Against coordinated multi-front saturation attacks designed specifically to overwhelm the system, it's failing in exactly the way simple mathematics predicted. So what specifically makes this interceptor depletion so devastating? Let's break down exactly what the strategic implications are. First, analysts have addressed the assumption that Iron Dome provides indefinite protection regardless of threat duration or intensity. Israeli defense planning treated Iron Dome as a reliable shield that fundamentally altered strategic calculations, allowing continued civilian economic activity during conflicts and providing freedom of action for offensive operations without fear of devastating retaliation against Israeli cities. Military strategists have demolished this assumption by pointing out the obvious mathematical reality. No defensive system can sustain indefinite operations against numerically unlimited cheap threats when each defensive engagement consumes expensive production-limited interceptors. As one defense analyst noted, Iron Dome is brilliant technology, but it's not magic. You can't violate basic mathematics. Eventually, you run out of interceptors, and then the system is just expensive metal sitting on the ground. This is fatal to Israeli strategic planning because the entire defensive concept for the past decade has assumed Iron Dome reliability as a foundational element. Now here's the kicker. Israel designed Iron Dome specifically to avoid the impossible dilemma of either accepting rocket attacks on civilians or launching massive ground operations to physically eliminate launch capabilities at high cost. Iron Dome was supposed to provide a third option: effective defense without unsustainable costs. But the current depletion essentially proves that this third option was only viable under limited conflict scenarios, and that adversaries have now figured out how to force Israel back into the original terrible choice. The system that was supposed to eliminate the dilemma has itself been eliminated as a reliable option. Second, Israel faces the interceptor production bottleneck that cannot be quickly resolved. Even with U.S. assistance and emergency production measures, ramping up interceptor manufacturing takes months to years. Meanwhile, adversaries can manufacture simple rockets far more quickly and cheaply. Third, adversaries now understand the depletion vulnerability and can be expected to exploit it. Having successfully depleted Israeli stockpiles through sustained attacks, hostile forces now face the temptation to launch major operations while Israeli defenses are critically weakened. This leaves Israeli strategists in an impossible position. On one hand, they could acknowledge the depletion publicly and seek immediate ceasefire agreements, but that would require concessions from a position of acknowledged weakness. On the other hand, they could maintain operational security about true depletion levels while quietly rushing resupply efforts. But that risks catastrophic failure if adversaries launch major attacks against cities that no longer have adequate protection. The impossible part is that neither option restores the strategic situation that existed before depletion became critical. Israel is caught in a strategic bind created by the mathematical limits of even the most sophisticated technology. Acknowledge weakness and negotiate from vulnerability, or maintain the facade while praying adversaries don't recognize the window of opportunity. Those are the only choices left. Military and strategic analysts across the political spectrum are calling this a watershed moment, and their assessments are remarkably consistent. Colonel Douglas Macgregor has been among the most vocal in warning about this vulnerability. What we're witnessing is a fundamental shift in the regional balance of power. Iron Dome was never designed to sustain the kind of prolonged multi-front attrition warfare we're now seeing. When your defense costs $50,000 per engagement and your adversary's offense costs $500, you will eventually lose the attrition war, no matter how superior your technology. Macgregor explained that this represents a broader challenge for U.S. defense strategy as well, as American forces increasingly rely on expensive precision systems that could face similar saturation tactics. Michael Knights, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, added his analysis. The interceptor depletion problem was entirely predictable. What's remarkable is how quickly adversaries adapted their tactics to specifically exploit this vulnerability through coordinated, sustained attacks designed simply to drain Israeli stockpiles. But here's what's truly telling. Even Israeli defense analysts, who typically maintain optimistic public assessments, have begun acknowledging the severity of the interceptor shortage. Yoav Limor, military correspondent for Israel Hayom with close defense establishment sources, wrote that the interceptor situation has reached critical levels that require immediate attention at the highest levels of government. When even Israeli military correspondents with access to official sources acknowledge this level of concern, we've moved beyond speculation into confirmed strategic crisis. So what does this actually mean? This isn't just compelling military analysis. The implications cascade across Israeli security strategy, U.S. Middle East policy, regional stability calculations, and global defense assumptions. First, the immediate impact on Israeli security posture. With Iron Dome effectively depleted, Israeli cities face direct vulnerability to rocket and drone attacks. This fundamentally alters Israeli risk calculations for military operations. Any action that might trigger mass retaliation now carries the prospect of successful attacks on Israeli population centers. According to military analysts, this constraint will likely force more cautious Israeli operational planning and potentially more willingness to accept diplomatic solutions that would have been rejected when defensive capabilities were robust. Second, the broader implications for U.S. defense commitments. The United States has invested billions in Israeli missile defense capabilities. The depletion of these systems, despite massive investment, raises fundamental questions about the sustainability of defensive-oriented strategies against determined adversaries willing to wage attrition warfare. This vulnerability now becomes a case study in how expensive Western defense systems can be systematically overwhelmed by mass, cheap alternatives. The era of assuming technological superiority provides reliable defensive solutions may be ending. Third, the regional stability implications as adversaries recognize Israeli vulnerability. With Israeli air defenses critically depleted, groups like Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias face a strategic window of opportunity where Israeli cities are more vulnerable than they have been in over a decade. This creates dangerous incentives for escalation before Israeli capabilities are reconstituted. The deterrent value of Iron Dome depended not just on its technical effectiveness, but on adversaries' belief that it would remain effective indefinitely. That belief has been shattered. Finally, the implications for global defense industrial base assumptions. The Iron Dome depletion exposes a fundamental vulnerability in modern Western defense strategy: the assumption that limited production of expensive, highly capable systems can sustain prolonged conflicts against adversaries willing to employ mass, cheap alternatives. According to defense industrial experts, this situation will likely force major reconsideration of stockpile strategies, production surge capabilities, and the fundamental economics of defensive systems in sustained conflicts. This is about so much more than Israeli missile defense. It's about whether expensive, technologically advanced Western defense systems can sustain the kind of prolonged, high-intensity conflicts that peer adversaries are preparing to wage. This situation has thrown Israeli defense and political establishments into intense internal debate. According to Israeli media reports, the reaction has fractured into competing approaches. One faction, represented by hardline security officials, is demanding aggressive offensive operations to physically destroy launch capabilities before adversaries can exploit the defensive vulnerability. They're calling the interceptor depletion a reason to escalate, arguing Israel must eliminate threats at their source. Meanwhile, a growing number of defense analysts are quietly acknowledging that the depletion reveals fundamental flaws in strategy that cannot be solved purely through offensive action. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, strategists are concerned that offensive operations will trigger exactly the kind of mass retaliation that depleted defenses can no longer adequately counter. Then there's a third group trying to emphasize emergency resupply from American stockpiles as the primary solution, but that position becomes more untenable as U.S. defense officials acknowledge their own stockpile limitations, and the Israeli government's public response has been carefully managed. Official statements emphasize Israel's multi-layered defense systems and ongoing resupply efforts, language designed to project confidence while avoiding specific acknowledgement of vulnerability levels. The careful avoidance of specific interceptor numbers tells you the actual situation is more concerning than public confidence suggests. The gap between public assurances and observable defensive posture changes indicates the private assessment is considerably more alarming than official statements acknowledge. So here's the bottom line. Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system has been depleted to approximately 5% of pre-conflict interceptor levels through sustained, coordinated attacks specifically designed to overwhelm the system through attrition. This isn't about one weapon system running low on ammunition. It's about whether expensive, production-limited Western defense technologies can sustain prolonged conflicts against adversaries willing to wage systematic wars of attrition. When your adversaries can manufacture threats faster and cheaper than you can manufacture defenses, you're not facing a temporary logistics challenge. You're facing a fundamental strategic vulnerability that technology alone cannot solve. And if this depletion leads to successful mass attacks on Israeli cities because defensive capabilities proved finite, then we're learning a devastating lesson about the limits of technological solutions to strategic problems. So keep watching this crisis closely. The resupply efforts continue, but production constraints mean reconstitution will take months at minimum. Israeli operational posture is quietly adjusting to reflect reduced defensive confidence, and regional adversaries are calculating whether the window of Israeli vulnerability presents opportunities that won't remain open indefinitely. The stakes have never been higher. The evidence of critical depletion has never been clearer. And what happens next will determine whether technological superiority can overcome unfavorable mathematics, or whether we're witnessing a fundamental shift in regional military balance that reverberates far beyond the Middle East.